This week, we're so excited to have back with us Dr. Stephen Phelps, and his topic today will be When Spirituality and Religion Meet Science, a Baha'i Point of View. Dr. Stephen Phelps received bachelor's degrees in physics and philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD in physics from Princeton University, specializing in cosmology. He served at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel for 13 years in its research department, where he coordinated the indexing and collation of the Baha'i sacred writings and their translation from Persian and Arabic into English. During that period, he concurrently held a research position in the physics department at the Technion University in Haifa and published original research on the masses of nearby galaxies. His recent published research includes a machine learning test for COVID-19. He currently resides in the Portland area with his wife and 3 daughters. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Phelps.
Thank you so much. As you know, this is the second part in a I suppose a mini series, and the first part of this talk discussed most of the points that I would want to bring up in kind of an introductory presentation on the topic of science and the Baha'i Faith. What are some principles of the Baha'i Faith that facilitate the unity of science and religion? What are some common features of true science and true religion? What are some differentiators? And there was a lot of content in that that first talk, which won't be necessary to get into this talk, because what I wanted to try to do was to come at the subject from a slightly different direction, and one that you might perhaps not have seen before. And what I'll do is share a screen, and it can pretty much be summed up in just about one slide, but it's going to take a while to get through the slide, and I hope there'll be time for conversation around these ideas. What I wanted to start with was, I guess, the question underlying it all. What is the nature of reality? To what degree do we have access to reality? And what tools do we have at our disposal to describe it? And in particular, when we talk about, when we want to describe the world as it appears to our senses, we find, in other words, when we want to describe the world as a physical thing, as a material thing, what we find is that it is nearly sufficient to be able to describe everything in the physical world. It's nearly sufficient to be able to collect the physical evidence, to be able to use the scientific method, the laws of mathematics, to deduce laws underlying the world of observation, and then to make further predictions from those. But what if the ultimate reality of things includes more than what our physical senses can perceive? How would we describe that reality if all we have to describe it are things derived from the physical senses? In particular, the idea that's expressed in the Baha'i writings that I think we find expressed essentially in its essence in many of the religious traditions of the world, and also many of the philosophies of the world, is that the world that we can observe and explain is something like shadows flickering on the wall. Plato famously had this imagery, this metaphor of prisoners chained to the floor of a cave their entire lives, chained in such a way that they can only see in one direction. All they can see are shadows flickering on the wall, shadows that were cast by others behind them carrying objects back and forth in the torchlight. So really all they're seeing is flickering torchlit shadows of other objects. And these other objects that are being carried behind them are objects of, like puppets, basically, figures of animals and other sorts of things that we see in the real world. So what we're really seeing are shadows, and not just shadows, but we're seeing shadows of models which are themselves already one or more degrees removed from the real. But being clever, we come up with our own language to describe these shadows on the wall. We find very good ways of predicting. When we see a certain shadow, we tend to see another shadow right after it. If we see, a certain half of one shadow, we can predict pretty well what the other half of the shadow is going to look like. We have a whole shadow language to describe the entire world that we have access to, and that shadow language works pretty well for us. But there are those who live in the cave who somehow get it into their heads, this strange idea that maybe reality is more than the shadows on the wall. And somehow, occasionally one of those cave prisoners is able to break their chains and leave the cave, see, first of all, what was behind them, but beyond that, leave the cave and see the real objects in the world and see the light of the sun itself, the source of all light. Of course, they go back into the cave, and as they try to explain this to their fellow cave dwellers, they're laughed off, because after all, what evidence is there to those who are chained to the floor of this cave? What evidence is there of this three-dimensional world when all you have access to is the two-dimensional surface of the wall of the cave? That is, I think, of such a powerful metaphor for understanding the position of the great religions of the world as to the true nature of reality, that ultimately it's as though it were some higher dimensional thing, and all we have access to is a lower dimensional representation of it. And that is what we are trapped in. That is the human condition, which there's no escaping from, because those who are able to break the chains, maybe that only happens every millennium or so. So what can we do to try to reach into that world and explain it? We have to describe it using the tools and vocabulary and conceptual framework of the wall of the cave that we've developed to describe the shadows of the wall of the cave. We develop a metaphorical language to describe what we take to be this three-dimensional reality. That metaphorical language will certainly resemble, in some way, it'll have a correlation to that higher three-dimensional reality that it's trying to describe. But ultimately, like any shadow, it's only going to capture the thing that it's the shadow of. It's only going to capture that thing in an imperfect way. The metaphors will always break down at some point, and it will never be able to capture more than, more than this reduced dimensional representation of it. So we may have to appeal to multiple metaphors. A single metaphor is not going to do it. So we throw a bunch of different metaphors against it in the hope that approaching it from enough directions will capture enough of the nature of that reality to be able to describe it accurately. So that's a bit of a prelude to what I wanted to talk about in the next few slides here. And here's what I had in mind, is to talk about some central metaphors that are found in the Baha'i writings, and not just in the Baha'i writings, actually. All of these metaphors are found almost pervasively through world literature of the East and the West, as it tries to grasp with these realities that are beyond the realities of the senses. So we're going to look briefly at each of these metaphors: the metaphor of light, of water, of the tree, of word, elixir, will, circle, and shadow. This is not, I think, a complete list. it's what I was able to come up with late last night as I was throwing these notes together. So I may have missed some obvious ones, and I welcome commentary and feedback in the discussion that follows on my choice of metaphors to have a brief look at. So let's look at each one of these in turn, and hopefully in the end we'll come up with maybe a few conclusions about the subject under study. So the first metaphor is that of light. The idea that reality is essentially a kind of an emanation of light, that there is a source. The source is compared to the sun. All of reality is thought of as rays of the sun. This is found quite pervasively in the Baha'i writings. There are many things, many powerful aspects of this metaphor of light. I'll be sharing some quotations from the Baha'i writings on each of these, and we won't have time to read through them all. You might have time to glance at them as I'm speaking, and I'll share these slides at the end for those who want to go back to it and look at these quotations. But among the powerful things that you can unpack from this metaphor of light, first of all, light seems to be everywhere. It's all pervasive. It tends to reveal things, that we're in darkness, and you throw light on them, and now you know something you didn't know before. So it's connected to knowledge in a very fundamental way. There isn't just one kind of ray of light, but light comes in different modes and colors and intensities. The light, once the light shines from the sun, it shines eternally, or the ray exists eternally as it travels from the sun. So there's this idea of infinitude in time associated with the light that shines from the sun. As we look out into the sky, we can see the light cast by objects, galaxies that are billions of years old. So the light is really a timeless thing. There's also part of this metaphor helps to explain the relationship of the ray of light to the sun. The ray of light tells something of the nature of the sun. It gives us information about the sun. The wavelength and the intensity of the light conveys information about the sun, but at the same time, it's not the sun. It doesn't share in the substance of the sun. In fact, the sun is effectively, as far as our physical bodies are concerned, might as well be infinitely far away. The sun is completely unapproachable. One can enjoy the rays of the sun, but to touch the surface of the sun would mean the dissolution of our elements. So that's just a few points that come to my mind as I think about the metaphor of light, particularly the metaphor of the sun and the rays of light, and how much they bring to an understanding of ultimate reality. But all of these metaphors break down at some point. The metaphor of light breaks down at least at the point where the ray of light continues always to emanate from the sun. It never returns to the sun. And that's part of the ultimate reality that we want to, that seems to be described by the spiritual teachings of all faiths, that having proceeded from the one, there's ultimately a return to the one. And the model of emanation doesn't quite capture that. So that's perhaps one reason why we need to appeal to other kinds of metaphors to give us other angles on this reality, which ultimately cannot be directly referenced in words, but only kind of tangentially using these metaphors. Many beautiful quotations from the Baha'i writings using the metaphor of light. The light is also something which unifies. It's something in the second quotation, it's something which comes in different colors, and people get captured or distracted by the different colors and don't realize the oneness of the source. This fundamental metaphor of emanation is described in several chapters of Some Answered Questions by Abdu'l-Baha. Another central metaphor is that of water. In this metaphor, there is a constant rain. The rain is described or compared to the grace of God. The rain is something which is life-giving. It brings life to the dry earth. That rain as grace is not something which has a predefined shape, but the rain, the water, takes the form of the container into which it falls. So there's a sort of malleability or fluidity to it. The rain actually comes in the form of individual drops. So there are elementary realities associated with this phenomenon, which are temporally defined. The drop ultimately merges into the sea once it falls to the earth and makes its way to rivers, and all the rivers ultimately flow into the sea. So the metaphor of water and particularly of the drop in the ocean gives this idea of an ultimate source from which all things are derived and to which all things return. So that's in a way an improvement on the metaphor of the ray and the sun, because in the metaphor of the ocean and the drop, you capture the circularity of it. You capture the idea that there's some cycle through which the water flows. And ultimately everything flows down to the will, which is the source of all things, the substance of all things. The Baha'i writings describe it as a sea. This ocean is the ocean of the will, of which we are all drops. Abdu'l-Baha talks about this idea of the malleability of the grace as water, which takes the form of its container in one of his tablets, which I've quoted here. The idea of the ephemerality of the drop is also captured beautifully by Abdu'l-Baha. The idea of the will, of the ocean of the primal will, of which we are really the waves and forms on that ocean, is also described by Abdu'l-Baha. So the third of the metaphors I want to introduce is that of the tree. This metaphor is an organic metaphor. The tree is something which is constantly in motion. It's constantly growing. And it's not just growing randomly, but it's growing in such a way as to produce something. So there's this idea of directed motion in the growth of the tree, an idea of teleology. There's also an idea in the metaphor of the tree of the interconnectedness of the different parts of the tree. Even though the leaf is very different in appearance and in function from the bark and from the fruit and from the root, nevertheless, there's an intimate connection between all the parts of this world tree. But amidst all the parts of the tree, there's one part of that tree which stands out as being special, and that's the fruit. The fruit of that tree, which humanity is compared to in the Baha'i writings, is special in part because the fruit contains the secret of the immortality of the tree, because the fruit contains the seeds, and from the seeds spring new generations of fruit. So there's something special about humanity. At the same time, humanity is organically connected with everything else in the world and shares a common origin with everything else in the world. There's everything comes from one and returns to one. And the seed is the common origin of all life, of all the parts of the tree, just as there's a common origin to all life on the planet. The metaphor of the tree also emphasizes and is often used to express the principle of the oneness of humanity. We are all the fruits and the leaves of one tree. And finally, the metaphor of the tree can be used to explain the mystery of sacrifice, that the tree comes from the seed, and the seed sacrifices its reality and gives of itself, sacrifices its form for the tree that emerges from it. Although the essence of the seed nevertheless persists and is contained within every part of the tree. I'll note that I'm ignoring the final column because I'm not going to have time to even probably refer to these, but for each of these metaphors, there are examples in nature. And primarily these are drawn from physics, which is where I have the most experience. And we can maybe talk about some of these in the discussion. And so on the metaphor of the tree, we have quotations that if we're familiar with the Baha'i writings at all, we've seen we've seen at least the first one, "Ye are all the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch," in one of the tablets of Abdu'l-Baha. And these other quotations also on sacrifice and on the sort of the connectedness of all things. And also the metaphor of the tree and the life cycle of the tree also gives us the idea that there has to be renewal and rebirth, that there are seasons of decay, there are seasons when all the leaves drop from the tree, seasons of winter, but those seasons are always followed by spring and summer, and there's always a return and a renewal of the fruit that appears, maybe a different fruit that appears, but with the same sweetness and the same character as the fruit that appeared the seasons before. So again, a lot can be extracted from this metaphor of the tree. The fourth metaphor is that of the word. So as you'll see, we're going to be moving from a little bit from the concrete and getting more and more abstract as we go. The metaphor of the word, which expresses this power of speech, is again pervasive in the Baha'i writings, not just in the Baha'i writings. It's one of the central metaphors of creation found in the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is seen as an expression of the will of the Creator. In the Baha'i writings, this Word is expressed as something that has transmutative power. It has the ability to revolutionize the world. This Word is not just an undifferentiated sound, but it's comprised of two different sounds. There's a B and an E that are joined and knit together. It forms two letters. It's a happy coincidence that it translates nicely into B and E. In the original Arabic, Kaf and Nun, the same word, B, the imperative B, also happens to be expressible in two letters. And these two letters are seen as in a way, the male and female principle in the world, the principle of agent and patient, the father of all things and the mother of all things, the substance of things and the form of things. So there is a concept of the world being almost this continually spoken syllable, which contains within it intrinsically a kind of duality, and everything is an emanation of this spoken word. Again, another powerful metaphor that expresses something about the world, which we see in the realm of physics. You know, we also see dualities in the realm of physics. We see everyone's familiar with E equals mc squared. There's a correlation, or really an equivalence between mass and energy, something which is very active, an agent, and something which is more passive, or the recipient of the active force. And we see many other examples of that also in the physical world. The next metaphor is that of the elixir. We see in a few places in the existing translations of Baha'u'llah's writings mentions of the elixir. This is, I think, quite closely related to the idea of word, because the elixir also is this transmutative thing, something that has power. Specifically, the metaphor of the elixir, which is comprised of this perfect pairing of the principle of mercury and sulfur, not physical mercury and sulfur, but the spiritual concept behind mercury and sulfur, which is really the same as the concept behind the B and the E. And in tablets not yet translated and available in English, Baha'u'llah describes in great detail these spiritual principles of mercury and sulfur, which are instantiations of agent and patient, of the active force and its recipient, which require purification and perfect balance and combination in order to produce the elixir. So this metaphor of the elixir and of alchemy, which is a centuries-long or millennia-long topic in the thought of the West and the East, is closely connected to these spiritual ideas of that there is innate potential within things that is unrealized, and for that potential to be realized in all of its transformative power, one has to be able to extract its elements. One has to be able to purify them, balance them, and join them together. So there are spiritual virtues and ideas closely allied to the idea of transformation or transmutation. And we see examples of that also in the physical world, in the crystallization of matter and in phase changes, where something, there's almost an instantaneous transition from one state of matter to another state of matter that expresses different kinds of potentialities of matter. As we move into our metaphors, we get to something even more abstract, the metaphor of will itself. Will itself is a metaphor. We attribute will, an act of will, to the creator in the moment of creation. But we know that talking about God's will, talking about God's love, talking about God's intention in the world is really ultimately a metaphor for something for which there are really no words to explain. It's a metaphor because it ultimately is an anthropomorphization. It takes an abstract concept and it imposes a human, it's a shadow on the wall. It's one of the shadows on the wall that we have to try to explain something deeper. And this particular shadow is one of the harder ones, I think, to escape, to sort of transcend, because it's so deeply interwoven in the way we think about things. But there is the metaphor of the will, of the will being generative, of there being a creative act of observation or of love, which is not just love for love for creation ere it is created, but love ultimately for one's own essence. Abdu'l-Baha talks about there being 4 different kinds of love, and he says the original love is the love of God for his own essence. You know, what does this mean? Already we know it's a metaphor because love is a human virtue. Intention is a human virtue, but there's some expression of circularity in that somehow the act of self-understanding, of self-remembrance, as the Bab puts it in one of his writings, which we might have gone into in the last week, and we won't go into it here, but I recommend having a close look at the second quotation, which really I think might upend a lot of ideas you might have had about the nature of reality, the nature of the human soul. The Bab describes all these in terms of the divine self-remembrance, which is this circular operation of the will. And the idea of circularity as a metaphor is also found in the notion of the circle itself, the notion of orbits, the idea of there being a center around which things circle, and that there is no getting to the center. We're forever confined to the periphery in a way, circling about something which is at the center. Just like the orbit of the Earth around the sun is always circling the sun, never reaches the sun, but is always turned towards it, and is always has the sun as the center of its motion. In a similar way, love is that supreme magnetic force that directs the motion of the spheres in the celestial realms. So the movement of the circle, the periodic movement, although described in the physical world quite well by simple equations, is only one manifestation of this force, which is described as the force of love. And finally, the last metaphor is that of the shadow itself, and that's really where I started with the metaphor of the cave from Plato. But this idea of the world really being in the state of a shadow, that's ultimately what we have, is expressed explicitly in this tablet of Abdu'l-Baha, where he says this present life is even as a swelling wave or a mirage of drifting shadows. Could ever a distorted image on the desert serve as refreshing waters? Know that the kingdom is the real world, and this nether plane only its shadow stretching out. The idea of there being counterparts in the spiritual world of physical things, that every physical thing is a sign and imprint of a spiritual thing. Every lower thing is an image and counterpart of a higher thing, and the quotations that follow also emphasize this idea of not just that the physical world is a kind of a shadow or let's say lower dimensional representation of a higher thing, but that there are repeated patterns. You know, even this whole metaphor of Plato's cave, only there's the primary signification of the metaphor is the contrast between the shadows on the cave and the objects that cast the shadows. But already Plato's metaphor contains, at least implicitly, the idea of there being at least three different worlds. There's the world of the shadow. There's the realm of the images that are being paraded back and forth behind the prisoners. But then the images themselves, or sorry, the objects themselves are themselves images of something yet more real. And to get to that more real, you have to escape the cave entirely and go outside and see the actual creatures that are being represented by those shapes in the cave. Similarly, Baha'u'llah talks about there being almost a limitless echoing patterns of archetypes found in all the worlds. And that's in the third quotation here. He says, "Know thou that whatsoever can be found in this mortal world, this realm of limitation, every name and description, every form and attribute that can be seen or heard, hath in each of the worlds of God manifestations and appearances corresponding to and befitting that world, and appearing with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute." We have this idea of repetition of archetypes, and each archetype may be a poor or a flattened representation of the real thing, but nevertheless contains is faithful to the thing which it is an echo of or a shadow of, in all the ways it can be faithful. So there's fidelity in the representation, but at the same time there's loss of information in the act of representation. This metaphor of the shadow also, to go back to the story that I outlined at the beginning, also can explain for us what is the station of the prophet. Why do we put the manifestations of God in a completely different kind of category from regular human beings? And the metaphor of the cave, I think, does a great job of explaining that. They're the ones who have broken the chains and gone outside and come back. Physically, they're the same as us, but they have an understanding of things which is simply not possible to get if your entire life has been staring at the shadows on the wall. So I feel like that's enough of me talking. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on this attempt at drawing out, let's say, some of the metaphorical vocabulary in the Baha'i writings, that each one of which might be thought of as a way into a subject which ultimately cannot be properly and fully expressed in words alone, but has to be expressed by means of these metaphors and images, each of which kind of uniquely gives us some angle on that reality, each of which at the same time is incomplete and lacking and breaks down at some point. So our ultimate goal, we might say, and extra points to whoever identifies the source of this quotation, is to go beyond this life of metaphor and to try to reach to the reality behind the images. So thanks for listening up to this point.
Thank you so much for that really in-depth. That was really interesting. I hadn't even thought of all those metaphors and different allusions in the Baha'i faith. So that was really great. Maybe if we could just stop sharing your screen so we could all interact with each other. That would be great. Okay, so now we'd love to have a Q&A portion. You can either put your question in the chat or you can use the raise hand button, which you can find by clicking participants, and then the button is in blue. So it looks like our first question is from Brendan, so I'll unmute you now.
Hey, Stephen, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. That was super interesting. You know, I had a question around, you know, some of what I'm seeing with a lot of my current friends who I consider very smart, but they're not very religious. And so they tend to, you know, agree that there's probably more to the world than what we see. There's more to reality than what we experience. But, you know, they're very skeptical or cynical of religious institutions. So they usually go for ideas around agnosticism or simulation theory. And I think, you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on specifically what you think about simulation theory and how that kind of compares and contrasts to the Baha'i writings?
Well, this whole presentation in a way is directed at precisely those people who are not, let's say, comfortable with the standard metaphors or the standard narratives that we have to describe religion and the truth behind religion. I don't think I could do better than Plato did 2,500 years ago in evoking this imagery of the cave as a way to describe the world. The simulation theory is kind of an updated version, I think, of Plato's cave. I mean, the shadows on the wall are the simulation, and they bear a resemblance to the real thing, but ultimately the real thing is outside the simulation. You know, there's the thing that's generating that simulation. I haven't read, I think, enough of simulation theory to critique it or even compare it in detail against the cave analogy, but I feel that the two share most of the substance in common. It may be that simulation theory does it, you know, because it's a different metaphor, but it may be that it can help in ways or bring other things to the table that the cave metaphor doesn't. But that's my sort of initial sort of reaction to that is to just return to that metaphor.
Thank you. Our next question is from Shahla, so I'll unmute you now.
Loved it. Thank you very much. I have 2 or 3 questions. One is that why did you not put love as a metaphor?
Oh, I included love in the metaphor will and circle,
Yes,
because the will is really, maybe I should have put, I didn't think of love, I guess, so much as a metaphor as much as the action of the will as it loves its own essence. So, you know, under will, I talked about the 4 kinds of love and the love of God for his own essence without defining it as its own metaphor. Perhaps it could have been done that way. Certainly, in presenting it this way, I don't want to be exclusive and say this is the only way to sort of slice up this information and present it. But that's a very good point. Yeah, love certainly deserves all the prominence we can give it, and you know, perhaps it needed to be pulled out into its own category.
I would do that, but of course it's up to you. No, the light. You said the light does not go back to the source. I'm not sure, because when you see the reflection in a mirror, depends on the purity of mirror. So if you have a mirror that's not is tarnished, you don't have much reflection. Whereas when you have a pure or very clear mirror, it reflects quite a bit. If you take a mirror outside, actually it also sort of, not only it reflects, but you can see its shadow playing on wherever you are reflecting. So I have
Speaking of which, speaking of which, I should have added the mirror as one of the metaphors. I mean, that's I guess an obvious one I missed. It's connected to light, of course, and in the mirror metaphor, the light is reflected back to you, so there's a kind of return. But in the metaphor of the ray and the sun, you know, once the ray escapes the sun, it, you know, astronomically at least, it doesn't turn around and come back to the sun. That's the only point I wanted to make.
Of that?
Sorry?
Because are we sure of that? If we can look at, take the example of the mirror and see that when sun reflects in the mirror, you can, if you hold it to even the wall, you can see the light on the wall. And if you hold it further out, so I'm wondering how much knowledge we have of the fact, does it return or not, or how far does it stretch? That's my question.
Well, as far as we can look out into the universe, and it's around, at this point, you know, billions of light years, as far as we can tell, light travels in a straight line. I mean, there may be some curvature to space-time itself, but not so much that it's bending all the way back. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see distant galaxies.
Okay. Now, it's interesting yet that you took the idea of the cave to reflect of this world. And I see the idea of the womb, you know, also very much similar, because my father used to have a story about twins sitting in the womb, and one says to the other, "Do you think there's a mother?" And the other one said, "Oh, no, no, no. When we die here, that's it all, because you're limited in what you can see."
Well, there's another one I missed, the womb. Two good reasons not to pull these sorts of talks together, like the late night before the thing.
Actually, you've done very well. I love what you put together. It's just that as you were speaking, things just popped into my mind, and that's a good talk. When somebody gives a good talk, it's you kind of, it opens your mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. So our next question is from Kamran. So I'll unmute you right now.
Good. Hi, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Stephen, I'm very glad that we meet, but in very strange circumstances. Mr. Dunbar wanted us to meet in the 90s. It never happened. And then my good friend Shadi Salehan has always wanted me to be in touch with you. So I actually think that this type of presentation should expand within the Baha'i world. And it is at the very heart of engaging the general public, because I think this is at the very heart of the harmony of science and religion. And the peoples of the world are really interested in it. So I've actually been thinking, I've given a number of presentations dealing with this very same issue. And I think in some ways, I think maybe in another world we were brothers or twins or something, the way that we think about this issue. So I gave a talk about the metaphoric approach to the concept of spirit. And I'm convinced that all the objects in the physical world can be used as metaphors for spirit. So it's not just 5 or 6 or everything in the physical universe can be a metaphor with different degrees of fidelity, and as you mentioned, also information loss, to approach the idea of spirit. So any investigation in the physical world is basically trying to find a lens to look at patterns of spirit, which you refer to as archetypes. Not only that, I'm also convinced of the holographic isomorphic nature of the concept of spirit being like a house of mirrors, that we go into it and it keeps replicating itself. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'm kind of convinced of this, that human consciousness is based on analogy and metaphor, and the same thing with language. Because without analogical structures or metaphor, there can be no human thought. So it must have been in the origin of existence for it to be like that. And as such, then I think that not only do I see a loop in human consciousness, but we actually find the same loop in the patterns of Baha'i writings. So this is why I think that somehow a group of Baha'is should explore these things and bring them out and correlate them with science, mathematics, and information science. So I'm really grateful. I see that other people are interested in these concepts.
Yeah, it really strikes me that what we're trying to do is build a different language. You know, it has different nouns and verbs and, you know, particles and so forth. And the objects of speech in this language are, you know, may have words that carry dictionary definitions in our standard dictionaries. What we're really trying to do is build, and all we can use are the words that we have. So what what you're left with doing are taking words we already have, like tree and light and water and so forth, and trying to infuse new meanings into them. And that can really be done through this narrative process, building a new narrative using these metaphors.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated that Shoghi Effendi defines independent investigation of truth as this correlation between science and so truth somehow appears in a dialectic between the two. So I think that, so I was giving a talk about spirit, and I used the concept of fractals and recursion. And then I mentioned to someone that the reason now we can actually understand the language of the Baha'i writings better is if I didn't have access to the concept of recursion or fractals, I don't think I would have seen that idea in the writings, even though it was there. So as our scientific understanding and mathematical there is development in mathematics and science, I think they also shed light and help us have stronger metaphors to actually understand the Baha'i writings. Anyway, thank you. I greatly appreciate this, and I hope I get your email and can contact you.
Thank you. Good to meet you finally.
Alex, I will unmute you.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for your talk. One thing that I've been wondering about is that there are some social teachings in the faith that Baha'is and friends of the faith find really challenging to accept, and I don't want to necessarily open that can of worms. But some of these teachings, the House of Justice has explained, they don't lend themselves to rational analysis. Nevertheless, many people try to speculate, or sometimes, unfortunately, get into debates about what might be the reason or the practical purpose of some of these laws. And there are some laws in the faith that, to my understanding, they don't have any practical purpose to them, but their significance is primarily having a spiritual symbolism, one of those being ablutions, which Baha'is do by washing their hands and their face before obligatory prayer, even if they've already bathed or showered or something. So it's not a matter of cleaning, it's not a matter of hygiene. And so I'm wondering if maybe some of these challenging social teachings of the faith, if it's possible that their primary reason is to be a symbol of spiritual reality, if some of the relationships among certain people that Baha'u'llah has prescribed might be so that human social reality can also serve as a metaphor or a reflection of spiritual reality, and not necessarily for some obvious practical benefit to us.
One, this may be a tangential response, but one of the, I think, powers of the shadow metaphor, where you have this higher dimensional reality projected onto this lower dimensional surface, is that a lot of unexpected, maybe contradictory or illogical things happen on the surface. To give an example, if you take a cube and you project it onto a surface, and that cube is tilted at any kind of an angle, the thing that's projected onto the surface is kind of a mess of lines and angles and so forth. And if someone were to say, well, all of those angles are right angles, and all of these lines are equal in length to the other lines, you might look at the surface of the wall and say, that's just not true. Some of these lines are less than 90 degrees and others are greater than 90 degrees, and not all the lines are of equal length. So there's information lost in the projection of this higher dimensional reality onto the lower dimensional reality. And if we can't see into, if our brains can't reach into that reality of the cube itself, and if we're always confined to the projection of the cube, we may never be able to reconcile what we think that thing is. It's perfect and it's equal and it has this structure and symmetry and so forth to it. But when it's thrust into the world, it loses some of that beauty and symmetry. And that's part of the essential and sort of necessary loss of information that happens when you pass into this realm of water and clay. I don't know if that helps with some of the more challenging teachings, but it's something that a potential, I guess, application of this toolbox of metaphors that we have.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nuria, so I will unmute you now.
Thank you very much. Appreciate. When we listen to talks of Mr. Adib Taherzadeh, we see that he uses metaphor all along his talks, and that
stories.
makes everything so understandable to us. Otherwise, I would have no idea what all these writings talking about. As a matter of fact, there is a quotation says that the material realm, being most accessible to human understanding, serves as a vehicle of metaphor and analogy to assist in comprehension of the principles of spiritual reality. This is page 100, page 100, Spiritual Reality booklet. So therefore, without this, we have no idea. And we have talked to many people, friends of the faith. When we put these things into the garment of the example and analogy, they really get it. If they have no prejudice, they get it. So therefore, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Taherzadeh was an absolute master of employing these metaphors and a master of storytelling, which we can see glimpses of in his in all of his books, especially his 4-volume series on the Revelation of Baha'u'llah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once on pilgrimage, I was a staff member at the World Center and sat in the back row as he gave one of his pilgrim talks. And I remember he started off the pilgrim talk not by saying anything, but just taking questions from the audience. He says, does anybody have any questions? And everyone raised their hand, and everyone had a completely different question for him. And he took all the questions, and then he paused, and then he gave this talk, which wove all the questions together into one. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to answer all the questions kind of in the course of this one talk that he gave, which he composed on the spot, using, of course, these beautiful stories and images, as he always does. He's really a genius.
Great. Okay, I see Shahla, so I'll unmute you now.
This issue of laws is interesting because we do have laws that we don't fully grasp, but we follow because we believe in Baha'u'llah. And I also wondered, why do you wash your hands and face for some prayers and not for others? Why is it that we do it for this one and not that one? If it's a matter of cleanliness, then we should be doing it for all prayers. And so I'm waiting to get to the pearly gate and ask these questions. So, because there are a number of questions that you kind of don't have an answer. And I used to ask my father this question, and my dad said, in the Christian religion, Christ said, eat fish every Friday. So the people ate fish every Friday. They had no idea why not on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, and why only on Friday. And the way my father explained it was that the animals were caught at the beginning of the week, and it was hung in the bazaar, and people came and they bought a cut of that animal. And by the time Friday came, because there was no refrigeration, the meat was bad, and if you had ate it, you would have got sick. So Christ, instead of trying to explain the idea of microbes and diseases, which would have been difficult for the grasp of the time, he said, eat fish on Friday. So then when my father explained that, it kind of made sense to me, because now with this virus, we are constantly washing our hands no matter what. So I'm wondering what some of these laws really mean eventually when we fully grasp the realities of those laws. So, I mean, often I argued some of these laws with friends who are not Baha'is. For example, the law of chastity. A lot of my friends said, okay, chastity. What if somebody never gets married? Does it mean that he or she has no right to feel that physical enjoyment? And then AIDS came along. And that kind of explained it a little bit more even to some of the Baha'is. So there's a specific reason for some of these that I don't think we have fully grasped it. And I'm wondering if we will in our lifetimes. So I'm wondering if you have any answer for that.
No particular answer. I mean, except that all of these, to bring the metaphor of the tree back in, there's change and evolution in all of the circumstances of life. I believe the House of Justice has been given enormous power and range of activity by Baha'u'llah to do what is needed to keep the Baha'i faith in tune with the exigencies of the day. That is its mandate by Baha'u'llah in his Book of Laws. And I'm fully confident that it will execute on that mandate and keep the Baha'i faith in tune with the needs of the day.
Great. Next we have Kamran, so I'll unmute you.
Just I think quick comment, which I think is important. Miss, I forgot her name, Nuria someone, raised the issue of metaphors. I think even though metaphors are empowering, they're also dangerous, because if we overuse any metaphor, then it can reify human thinking. And we then assume that that nonsensible reality which we are trying to understand becomes limited by that. For instance, sometimes I feel we overuse the, let's say, the metaphor of a cup for capacity, or the metaphor of mirror for some other functions, because as I think, again, I'm convinced that we can use innumerable metaphors for all these nonsensible realities. I have only done research with regard to two things. One is spirit, the other one heart, metaphors of heart. And both of them, heart, you have fewer metaphors than spirit. Spirit is infinite. But if we use any metaphor, then we run into reification. And reification is something that has plagued humanity for thousands of years. And I actually find that oftentimes, even as Baha'is, we fall for it. As an example, in some answered questions, let's say Abdul Baha says there are 5 kinds of spirit. We may understand what metaphor is, but there are many layers of metaphor. So metaphors can become metaphors of metaphors. And then we think that there are actually 5 kinds of spirit. So the 5 kinds reifies it. So anyway, I think it's very important for us to study the nature of metaphors rather than just linguistic devices that give us access to something.
And I think in the Baha'i writings or in the Baha'i revelation, what the safety that we have is that Baha'u'llah is very explicit in telling us that it's all metaphor. And so I think the danger of reification, this danger of taking the metaphor to be the hard and unchangeable truth of things, which has happened in the past, I think is less likely to happen in a faith that that is very upfront in its own in acknowledging the limitations of its own vocabulary and its own and its own sort of conceptual framework. That we know, because Baha'u'llah has told us, that he's only revealing a glimpse of ultimate reality that is not itself final.
Great. Next question is from, just says iPhone, so I will unmute you.
Hello, iPhone.
Hello, everybody. It's Kendall Williams, actually. I didn't realize it's just iPhone. So I wanted to dialogue about materialism, which, you know, I'm 52 and in science most of my life. And so the dominant competing ideology for all things religious and very influential philosophy is materialism. And it seems so 80s now with simulation theory out there, but I wanted to make a point and then sort of get your thoughts as well, Stephen. First, it seems to me that materialism as a philosophy is the exact opposite of what you're describing, right? It's almost a form of fundamentalism or biblical literalism as applied to the natural world and to the material world. Because whereas the Bab is saying that everything in the natural world is actually a reflection of something spiritual, something that exists beyond it. It's almost like biblical literalism, that somebody looks at the meaning of the text, it can only mean that what that says. It can't have the metaphorical understandings that we know as Baha'is that all of the scriptures have. So I wanted to make that point, but in my thinking about materialism as well, it seems to me increasingly obvious that, and to many people, and maybe this idea of the whole world being a computer simulation is even people sort of implicitly recognizing this, that materialism is really quite limited in its ability to explain the complexity of the world that we see. And though it's a highly conservative philosophical position, it's almost too conservative to be true. Because increasingly, the more we know about the world, the more it can't be fully explained in a purely bottom-up process. So those are my thoughts. I was just curious if you had others.
The philosophy of materialism, to me, fairly neatly maps back onto the metaphor of the shadow in the cave. The materialist is the one who, looking at the shadows on the wall, says, it's only shadows. And you can't argue with that being chained with the materialist to the floor of the cave next to them, not even able to look at them, but only able to look at the shadows. All we have reference to, all we have access to are the shadows. So someone who says it's just shadows, prove to me otherwise. And I can't say, turn around and say, oh, look behind you. All I can say is, well, which model of reality works better? And by works better, that's where it all, I've now shoved all of the problem into what do you mean by works better? Okay, because works better can mean, well, what gives better predictions as to what happens next on, you know, in this panoply of shadows on the wall. And maybe the shadow specialist who spends his whole life thinking it's just shadows might do a better job than me, who's spending a lot of my time thinking about what's behind, might do a better job at me as sort of at talking and predicting what's happening on the wall. But I would continue to maintain that the model of reality that is three-dimensional and that sees the world as two-dimensional, even though I have no direct evidence for it, ultimately works better. Why does it work better? Because it has better human outcomes. I'm launching into kind of a separate talk here, but the talk would be on...
That's a good point.
ultimately the pragmatism that I see in Baha'u'llah's own writings. When Baha'u'llah describes his station and his function to a good non-Baha'i friend of his, wasn't a follower. This was Manakji Sahib, his Zoroastrian friend from Baghdad days. And Baha'u'llah describes, basically Manakji Sahib asks him all of these questions, philosophical questions. No doubt is interested, since we talked last, you've made this prophetic claim. So tell me about this. Baha'u'llah gives him the imagery of the physician. He doesn't say, I'm giving sort of the correct set of axioms about spiritual reality. He says, I'm giving the remedy. And the remedy depends on the sickness. And the remedy for today is specially tuned, specially concocted to deal with the sickness of today. And the sickness of today is disunity and hatred on a global scale. And so the remedy I'm bringing is a remedy that is going to enable all the different tribes, peoples, ways of life, mental modes of thinking, so that they can all find some sort of common ground. And Baha'u'llah does this so brilliantly with that metaphor and so brilliantly throughout his writings in giving us a common theological ground to understand the idea of the unity of religions and a common mental space for the secularly minded person and the spiritually minded person to also come together and to find some unity of action in the world. And Baha'u'llah does this again in a later tablet he wrote to Manakji Sahib, but in demonstrating this principle, in answer to a very technical philosophical question about the relationship between God and the universe, and Baha'u'llah has given 4 different options. Instead of picking one of the 4 and saying this is the correct answer, Baha'u'llah gave a very, on the surface, equivocal answer, and when pressed, he goes on to say that there is truth to be found in all of these different schools of thought. Baha'u'llah, and in several other places in his writings, when his interlocutors tried to pin him down and say, option A, B, you have option A, option B, tell me which is the right option, Baha'u'llah would invariably say, well, they're both correct from a certain point of view. And I think in doing so, he's laying the foundations for, this is the remedy, this is the remedy of the divine physician. And that is to open up the space of conversation so that tribe A doesn't have to say, well, my view is totally rejected, and now we're all going to have to join tribe B, because that's not the solution. Again, in one of Baha'u'llah's tablets, mystical tablets, this is in Call of the Divine Beloved, it's the 3rd tablet. Baha'u'llah basically says this difference of minds, this difference of opinion is an ineradicable feature of the human condition. That's not a quote, but it's a paraphrase. And he said, so the solution is not one tribe wins. The solution is not, replace all the wrong opinions with the right opinions. The solution is forbearance, patience, love, kindliness, all the things we're supposed to be in the world. That's the solution, because there is no getting around the fact that different minded people are going to see the world in different ways. There are always going to be people looking at the shadows on the wall and saying, I'm sorry, but that's all I see. That's all there is. There has to be a way for that kind of mindset to coexist in the world with those who say, I'm not convinced. I think that there are shadows, that there are objects behind me, and I'm really looking at a kind of projection of a higher reality.
Great. I think Kurosh has a comment on this point, so I'll unmute you now.
Hi, Stephen. This is Kurosh. Nice to see you here. In regard to the metaphor of the cave and the shadow, the unseen realm, the realm that is outside of the cave, is having an influence on the course of things in the cave that we see the shadows on the wall. And so, in terms of predicting the future, if you think of just a short-term prediction, maybe the materialist can predict, the cube is going to move this way and give a very nice short-term prediction. But in terms of long-term prediction, like centuries, I think the model that assumes that there are influences from outside the cave, you know, in the form of the manifestation of God, infusing the world with love and spiritual teachings that suit the times. And I think the long-term prediction of the non-materialist, the one who acknowledges the three-dimensional or, you know, n-dimensional world, is going to be more accurate. And the same thing could be said for the past, you know, to explain that things that have happened in human history, which model really fits the facts better. Although there's a lot of argument that could go on about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, in explaining the universal currents of history, on a short term, on a sort of matter of what happens in the next microsecond, you're not going to do better than physics. But if you want to understand sort of the currents of history on 1,000-year time scales, well, physics is going to tell you it's entropy. That's all physics can sort of produce for you at those sorts of time scales, is the expectation that ordered states are going to end up becoming disordered. But what we see, in fact, is the opposite, not just in terms of human history over the last few thousand years, but in terms of life on the planet over the last few billion years. Now, it's not that this contradicts any particular laws of physics. It's not that you have to sort of explicitly add in some external force into the equation itself, but certainly conceptually, the current model of there being just four known forces, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear, can't be the final description of things, because it's leaving out motions. I mean, not measurable physical motions, but it's leaving out the movement of consciousness, let's say, at the sort of longest scales. And for that, other principles, it seems, need to come into the picture. On this topic, for those who are interested in this topic from a pretty rigorously thought through perspective, there's Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, which, as expected, was quite strongly attacked by the materialist camp. But I think he makes some very good points about the need to include some concept of mind or consciousness in our vision of the cosmos.
Great. Our next question is from Kaleem, and he says, what is the Baha'i view of revelation? Is revelation purely divine, or did it get polluted when it got appropriated in order to fit with worldly circumstances? I was listening to a talk of Dr. Surush where he described revelation as something which, even though it comes from the divine, the cause of it, according to him, is earthly.
I don't know. I don't know if I can comment on that statement in particular, but I would just refer back to the cave analogy. I mean, revelation, as far as we know, the words that have been left to us are shadows on the wall, just like everything else. That's all Baha'u'llah could leave us. What was in his mind, though, was what he saw and experienced when he left the cave, which none of us have seen or experienced. And we try to extrapolate from the words that were left, as imperfect and as impoverished as they are, as Baha'u'llah himself says, that they are imperfect and a poor representation of reality. They're all we have. And so we're forever left trying to extrapolate from these words, which somehow carry a mystical potency, which somehow have this ability to change people. And that, I think, is part of the proof of their origin. What other words have the power to fundamentally change people? And this leads us to the metaphor of the elixir. I mean, the word Baha'u'llah describes as like an elixir. It's magic. If you didn't understand, how these things work, the transformative power of the word is not supernatural. I mean, it's part of the fabric of things, but it seems supernatural to us because we're again chained to the wall and we're just seeing the shadows. So we don't understand why it's so transformative, but it has that kind of potency.
Richard, I will unmute you.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Mainly, I just wanted to say thanks for doing the talk. I think it's a really important topic in general, this understanding of the relationship between science and religion. And for my own background, and I think for a lot of folks in what has become a very largely secular world in a lot of places, this topic can be one that makes the Baha'i faith very approachable for a lot of people who don't know about it already. So I think it's a great topic to be investigated and discussed, and I just encourage you to keep having these types of discussions. One topic in particular I'll mention, and see if you have any specific comments on, is the concept of progressive revelation in the Baha'i faith, and how that may or may not have any parallel to the process of discovery in modern science. So I'd leave that and with you to comment on as you might want to, and otherwise just say thank you again for doing this kind of thing, and please do keep doing these. I look forward to participating in more of them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I do think that progressive revelation and the recent historical progress in modern science over the last few centuries are intimately connected. To me, they're aspects of the same process, which I've talked about in other talks, and so I'll just try to sum up in a sentence or two, and just refer you to things I've said in the past about it. But both progressive revelation and advance in modern science, I see in light of the principle of unfolding consciousness, which I think is the overarching narrative framework for the cosmos that is suggested in all the world's religious traditions. That is, that history is not a random sequence of events, but has a direction. That direction may not be expressible at the time scale of human lifetimes or even centuries. You see rise and fall of civilizations on vast time scales where things tend to go backwards for long periods of time, the collapse of the Roman Empire and so forth. But it inevitably gives rise to the seeds of the next civilization, which takes things farther. And this sort of directionality to history seems to be in the direction of expanding circles of unified, coherent activity on the part of conscious entities, which unlocks greater and greater potentialities which were hidden in the world. They were always there, but they had to be unlocked through matter coming together in particular configurations. The advance of science is a perfect example of that. I mean, it couldn't have come about without civilization having reached a certain point where you could have these whole cadres of individuals spending their entire lives just drilling down on particular questions of no immediate practical consequence. I mean, to have that kind of freedom and that kind of spare time and spare resources to be able to pursue these sorts of questions requires there being configurations of people working in such a way to make that possible. And I think the overarching narrative that we find in the Baha'i writings is that of a creation that in some way has been generated in order to produce consciousness of its own self, because in so doing it fulfills its purpose. The ultimate purpose of creation is self-knowledge, because the entire creation is the primal will's love for its own essence. The entire creation is a circle of taking place in universal cycles of unimaginably long periods of time, as Thomas Nagel has said it, the universe is in a process of waking up. But this process of waking up is infinite. It stretches forward and backwards infinitely in time. We're in a particular point in that process of waking up, which is very significant. It's maybe the most significant point in the whole process, because it's like this dawning awakening of consciousness. And when I say this point in time, I'm talking about the last 6,000 years, really, which is already just a drop in the bucket when we talk about the history of the human species, let alone the history of the progenitor species to humanity. So we're living in this just incredible moment when we're kind of waking up for that first moment and realizing our own selves, our own, and asking the question as to what our place in the universe is. And the history of progressive revelation and the history of modern science in that sense are completely hand in hand in this process.
Well, thank you so much. I think we will close off the discussion here. A big thank you again to Dr. Phelps. And thank you again also to everyone for adding to the discussion. That was a really nice, robust conversation we had afterwards.
Thanks a lot.
So our speaker next week is Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, and his topic is Spiritual Solutions to Global Economic Problems from a Baha'i Perspective. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern Time. So please invite all your friends and family. And if you are new to the Baha'i Faith or you would like to be on our mailing list and you're not already, we've put a link to our contact form in the chat below. So please fill that out. So now we're just going to close with a quotation by Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, set to music.
Intone, my servant, the verses of God that hath been received by thee. Intone, my servant, the verses of God that hath been received by thee, as intoned by him who hath drawn nigh unto him, that the sweetness of the melody may kindle thine own soul, and attract the hearts of all men. That the sweetness of the melody may kindle thine own soul, and attract the hearts of all men.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next Saturday.